Hi, I'm Joel the Landlocked Sailor, and today I'm here with not one, not two, but three bang sticks. And what we're going to do is compare the three actions. They are the three straight pulls of Great War vintage. First we have the M95, the Austro-Hungarian entrant to these three. And we have the Swiss K31, representative of the Swiss action in use at the time. And lastly, Canadian Ross Mark III. All these actions are quite different. We'll take a cursory look at that in this video and then get into depth in subsequent videos focusing on each rifle. In fact, I expect this series to run to five parts, possibly 6 in total. Today we have our introduction, and then we'll have one video on each of these rifles, and then the comparison, taking them to the range, and then finally comparing a couple others to how these three performed, specifically the SMLE and perhaps the last straight pull to have been brought into service, the Swiss K31. We'll see how it compares with these three, because it again is a very different action. In the direct comparison on the range, I'm going to be limited by a number of factors. Some of it's with the equipment, and some of it's just with what I have available to me, for example, for chargers. The range portion will consist of a target, a steel plate chest-sized target at 200 yards with sustained, rapid, but yet deliberately aimed fire. The goal is hits. That said, this isn't a test of accuracy. We have one long rifle and two short rifles that we'll be comparing. The Ross, of course, being a very long rifle indeed. The goal is to compare the actions more than anything. And we'll look at some other parts and pieces as we go, but primarily this is about the actions on the rifles and not the entire rifle itself. Simply, it wouldn't be a fair comparison with the one long and two short. I would far prefer having the long rifle version of the M95 and the Swiss K11 to do that. So because of that, we won't be comparing that specifically. We do, of course, only have a sample size of one. Now, each of these rifles is representative of its particular action. I've shot multiple rifles of each type, and these ones are quite representative of those. The M95 has a further hurdle in that this one is in fact an M95-30. It was converted to 8x56R. That said, as far as the conversions go, this one I find is very nice and very close to the originals. So I believe it is, close enough for government work anyway. If someday I manage to find an original 8x50 rimmed, then perhaps shoot another video and close that loop. But in the meantime, this will have to do. The range portion, the trials portion for these rifles will involve starting with a loaded rifle, as I said, shooting at the target at 200 yards with 2 reloads. Now this is where it gets a bit interesting, because the M95 takes an en-bloc clip, 5 rounds, 5-round magazine. Excuse me. The Ross, and as you can see, the Ross here is big boy. It takes 5 rounds for a 5-round magazine out of your standard 303 charger. I'll note right now too that this does not like being charger fed. It really doesn't, and that's not unusual for a Ross. The charger is offset on an angle on the right, and it does not load very well into this magazine. Unfortunately, that's just one of the drawbacks of the rifle. But lastly, we have the K11. The K11 loads from a charger with 6 rounds. If I pull one out and make it a 5-round load, I find they start having too much play in the charger. The rounds tend to get confused, and makes loading longer, and would make it an unfair comparison. So we'll just run them as they come. 5 rounds, 5 rounds, and 6 rounds, and sort it out at the end with the times. Now, if we take a quick look, you'll see what I mean about substantially different actions. Here we have the Swiss Schmidt-Rubin of the K31. You have your rail at the side here that guides the bolt, and also has a lug that goes through the camming surface here that turns at locking lugs are at the midpoint, and then you have this massively long bolt head in the front. But we'll get into more detail about that in due course. Next up we have my favorite. It's not just Canadian bias, I'll show you why I quite like this. Is the Ross has an interrupted screw like you'd see on the breech of an artillery piece. So I think that's a very interesting approach, rather than a solid lug. Of course, it increases your surface area quite significantly. But we'll talk more about the details of the action. The camming surfaces are internal to the bolt, and we'll have a look at that in a bit. Lastly, we have the M95, or Mannlicher action. This guy has two locking lugs in the front. The camming surfaces are inside the bolt, again internal to it. Actually, I guess you can't see, excuse me, doesn't want to go right now. There we go. There. Now you can see the locking surfaces on each side. So, 3 very different actions to compare. Now, the individual rifles have their own particular quirks. The youngest is the K31. It's 100 years old this year. The Ross is from 1914, and I haven't been able to date the M95, but it's 1918 or earlier. The M95, as I mentioned, is a conversion. It's an M95-30 in 8x56R, but we'll live with that. It does appear to be original parts, with the exception of the stock. It doesn't look like a new bolt was brought in or anything else in the action was changed. So we'll run with that, and hopefully it's an effective example. The K31, very little to say, or sorry, K11, very little to say about it other than it's a good representative example. The Ross judging by its dents and dings, has been through quite a lot. Now, when we're on the range, we're comparing the actions. We're not comparing the rifles as such. The rifles, well, we have one long and two short. We have very different sighting systems on them, so it's going to be a comparison of the action more than anything. Of course, the sights will contribute to that. The Ross sight is by far the best, having rear aperture and semi-aperture, depending on which of the ones in this sight you use. I think that's about it. So we will start with the M95, then move on to the Ross Mark III, and lastly the Swiss K31. Discuss each in detail, history and mechanics. And from there, we'll take them out to the range. As I said, we'll have start with a loaded rifle, 2 reloads each, 200 yards, chest size target. We'll load them with the number of rounds they are meant to take, run them, and then compare times, etc., and my impressions of them. After that, I think I'll probably bring in an SMLE to compare them with, because I believe the SMLE is probably the best rifle of World War I, for a number of reasons, but we'll get into that more later. Also, we'll bring in a K31 at the end, it being the sort of final expression of straight pulls. The last one brought into service, the last one in service. So, that's it for now. Hope you'll join me on the rest of this adventure, and have yourself a great day. Cheers.